You're listening to KCBS In Depth.
We need, and we haven't done this yet, to centralize our public health system.
The people, places, and issues the Bay Area is talking about.
We have done exactly what needed to be done, which is provide and give an effective vaccine.
The key for gun safety reform advocates is to think about this in the long term.
These times when change happen, often brief, so you want to get as much accomplished as possible.
This is KCBS In Depth.
It's a recall effort that many political watchers never expected to get off the ground, but here we are just over a week away from Election Day, and Governor Newsom, while leading in the polls, is still caught in a pitched battle for his political life. Welcome to KCBS In Depth. I'm Keith Menconi, and today on the program, we're going to check in on the latest developments in California's recall election and also take a broader look at what this political upheaval will mean for the state going forward. Starting things off, we're going to invite onto the show now, as we often do when faced with so many political questions, KCBS political reporter and the host of the State of California, Doug Sovern. Doug, welcome back onto KCBS In Depth.
Thank you, Keith. I accept your gracious invitation. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So let's start at the beginning because, as I know from my own social circle, there are an awful lot of Californians who are still only just now tuning into this whole political drama. But it does, of course, have quite a bit of history. So just briefly, how does this long shot recall, how did it get off the ground in the first place?
Well, you know, California has had the recall provision in the Constitution for over 100 years, back to Governor Hiram Johnson and the reform movement. It never amounted to anything until 2003 when Gray Davis was recalled and replaced by Arnold Schwarzenegger, of course. So this is the second time that a recall has qualified for the ballot. And frankly, pretty much every governor now, somebody starts a petition drive or more than one to recall them. Jerry Brown, anybody. But, you know, Gavin Newsom was no exception. But this one gathered steam and got on the ballot mainly, well, for a couple of reasons. One, there was a lot of unhappiness with the way he was handling the pandemic among people who had voted against him in the first place and would never vote for him. But what really got it on the ballot this time was that the combination of the pandemic disgruntlement and then his ill-fated trip to the French Laundry, which made him look like a hypocrite. And then a judge gave an extension, 4 extra months to gather signatures. This thing would not have made it onto the ballot without that extension. But because of the pandemic and the difficulty that created for the petition gatherers, they got extra time. And that is when it really started taking on some steam, some momentum. They got some money donated to hire some paid petition gatherers, and they were able to get enough signatures to get it on the ballot, which is a low bar in California. You only need 12% of the voters from the last election to get on the ballot, which is about half what you need in most other states that have recalls. And so it qualified, and here we are.
Here we are indeed, you know, really a perfect storm from the perspective of the governor. A lot of things came together to make this possible. Let's check in on the state of the race currently. It was looking pretty tight there for a while, but we've gotten some new polling that is showing Governor Newsom pulling away.
Well, it depends. I mean, the PPIC poll, their latest poll, Public Policy Institute of California, one of the best respected polls in the state, has always had it about where they have it now, which is 58% of likely voters saying they're going to vote against the recall, and I think it's 39% in favor. Their polling has been pretty steady. I mean, every month it's been in that 56, 58% against and 37, 38, 39% for. So there hasn't been much wavering in what they found. There are other polls, though, that have showed it much, much closer. An outlying Survey USA poll, but other polls have showed that when you look at likely voters, it tightens to a few points, maybe only 50% in favor of Newsom and 47 said they'd vote for the recall. So that's why we all think it's so close. But this PPIC poll, I think, is something of a sigh of relief for the Newsom camp, because it's showing them that, you know, the recall proponents are not gaining momentum. They're not widening their base of people, despite what you see on social media, despite what you may hear from some voters. It looks like Newsom's holding that gap. And as we see, people are voting already. Almost a quarter of the people have already cast their ballots. And the majority of those votes are coming from Democrats, and they're outperforming their registration numbers. So there are good signs for Newsom that he's going to hang on and beat this thing back.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about who the challengers are. It's a very wide open field. We're talking about 46 candidates that are going to appear on that ballot, most of them Republicans, and that, of course, is by design on the part of the Democrats who did not want to see a major Democrat name running against Newsom. Leading in the polls fairly consistently since the official names came forward for the challengers has been Larry Elder, the longtime conservative radio talk show host. Run through what we should expect to see from that candidates list.
Well, 46 candidates, and you've never heard of 40 of them. So most of them are people who they're not even asterisks in the polls. They might as well be typos on the ballot. I mean, no disrespect intended, but their mothers will vote for them and maybe a few neighbors. But then you've got, of course, Larry Elder, who the polling shows, 25, 26, 27% of the people who are selecting a candidate say they'll vote for him. Then you drop down.
And incredible, that's all you need to be a front runner in this thing.
This is true. I mean, you could win it with 20% when there's 46 people on the ballot. Then you drop down in that PPIC poll to 5%, where you've got a whole group bunched. That includes Kevin Faulconer, the former mayor of San Diego. It includes businessman John Cox, who got trounced by Newsom as the Republican on the ballot 3 years ago. It includes Kevin Kiley, a smart young assemblyman who's, probably not quite ready for prime time, but has impressed some people. No longer includes Doug Osee, the former congressman who dropped out of the race and endorsed Kiley after he suffered a heart attack. Kevin Paffrath, Meet Kevin, as he likes to be called, is probably the best known of those Democrats. He's a 29-year-old real estate investor who's got a following on YouTube. But even he, in most of the polls, is not getting out of the single digits. So it's likely at the moment that Larry Elder is going to win that replacement race. But, a big chunk of the electorate, 30, 40%, still don't know who they're going to vote for, or they're going to leave it blank. So you're going to see a big drop off between the number of votes on yes or no on the recall and the number actually voting for one of those candidates.
Yeah. All right. So a lot of names to wade through right there. We are going to get into some meatier political topics in just a second, but really just to make sure that we get all the basics covered, let's talk about what voters are going to encounter when they look at that ballot. Of course, for registered voters, ballots should already be out. Received mine in the mail a couple of weeks back, and there are going to be other ways to vote, too. I know that in Santa Clara County, at least, the vote centers are open this weekend, so a lot of different ways to vote. But what voters will see on those ballots is going to be a little bit different from what they're probably used to. Doug, run us through that. It's two questions.
Yeah, it's just a two-part ballot. The one question is, should Governor Gavin Newsom be recalled, in parentheses they write removed, so people understand what that means, recalled, removed from office. Then the second question is, which of these people do you want to replace him if he is recalled? Now, you don't have to vote on both. You're being asked to vote on both. Officially, you should vote on both. The Newsom campaign has run this campaign saying just forget the second question, just vote no. And in fact, it's true that if a majority votes no, the second part is moot. But if 50% plus one vote to recall the governor, then whoever finishes first on that second part will be the next governor. Newsom is not on that list. The lieutenant governor's not on that list. There's no prominent Democrat. You cannot write them in. There's an official list of write-in candidates. It does not include Newsom or Eleni Kounalakis, the lieutenant governor, so don't write them in. If you write in someone who's not qualified, your dog, Buster Posey, your Aunt Mabel, the governor, that vote won't be counted. But your yes or no vote will still be counted.
All right. So a couple of nitty-gritty points for everybody to keep in mind there. I want to let anybody know who's just joining the program that you are listening to KCBS In Depth, your weekly deep dive into the events and trends shaping life in the Bay Area and beyond. I'm Keith Menconi, joined right now by KCBS political reporter Doug Sovern. All right. Now that we are up to date on the state of play in this race, let's dig into some of the, as we said, meatier political questions that this election is raising about California politics. For that part of the conversation, we're going to welcome onto the program now Dan Schnur. He is a longtime California political strategist who's worked on 4 presidential and 3 gubernatorial campaigns. He's now a professor of 3 California universities, including USC, and then a little bit closer to home, UC Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies. So quite the resume there, really making me work for my pay on this show, Dan Schnur. Welcome to the program.
Keith, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I love the idea of Buster Posey for governor. Let's see if there's still time to pull that off.
If anybody can make it happen, maybe this is the brain trust to do it. So I want to start with probably the most perplexing question for somebody who's just starting to pay attention to this. Why is it that in a state so heavily Democratic, that Governor Newsom is having such a difficult time, Dan Schnur, that it's close at all. I mean, a lot of my friends are shocked to hear how close it was in recent weeks. And it seems like a lot of that just boils down to the enthusiasm of Democrats relative to the enthusiasm of Republicans who's actually going to turn out.
Well, you've nailed it exactly right, Keith. There's a very large cohort in the state of progressive Democrats who would not vote for a Republican candidate for any office if you put a gun to their head and a knife to their throat. But they're just not all that into Gavin Newsom. They voted for him 3 years ago because he was running against a Republican, even though on many issues he has very strong progressive credentials. Many California Democrats consider him to be too centrist and too establishment. And in a year in which they've been dealing with COVID and wildfires and school shutdowns and reopenings, they're just not all in that great a mood. So what Newsom doesn't have to worry about that group of voters switching over and voting for the recall. He just has to worry about them not voting at all. And the polls that have showed the race closer than this week's PPIC poll have demonstrated that when all registered voters turn out, Newsom beats the recall by a very large margin. But in many of the polls, not all of them, PPIC being an exception, when voters are screened for how likely they are to vote, the race gets much, much closer. And Newsom and his team have correctly identified their primary goal is convincing those progressive Democrats to turn out. That's why you're seeing ads with Elizabeth Warren and with Bernie Sanders, and why Kamala Harris and Joe Biden might be coming to the state, not to convince these people to love Gavin Newsom, but to convince them there's something to be really feared by his potential replacements.
Yeah. And Doug, expand on that a little bit. I mean, I know that you've been following the Newsom campaign pretty closely. What is the main case that Governor Newsom has been making? I know that he has been trying to link the frontrunner, Larry Elder, to Trump in any way that he can, and he's been calling this a recall campaign that's been brought by Trump supporters. So there is some efforts to link in the California voters' mind this recall effort to Trump.
Oh, absolutely. But, the gift for Newsom was when Elder got into this race, because initially it was stop the Trump Republican recall, Trump Republican, Trump Republican. That's hard to do when he's not on the ballot, right? It's an abstract thing connecting Kevin Faulconer or John Cox to Donald Trump. But when Larry Elder is there and you can link him directly to Trump, and Larry Elder has his own controversial and sometimes outrageous views, now it's Larry Elder, Larry Elder, Larry Elder. And that, I think, is what has really galvanized those Democrats who weren't paying much attention. They're saying, oh, my God, this guy could be our governor. That's what's getting them off the couch to fill out that ballot and vote no. And you've seen a shift in the Newsom ad campaign. They're still saying vote no on the Republican recall. All their ads call it the Republican recall. But as Dan said, you're seeing Warren and Sanders, to get the progressives, because they know they need the young progressives who haven't been voting that much yet in this election. But you're seeing some more outreach to the Latino community now because they know they need the Latinos. But what you're really seeing is a lot of scare ads warning you about the things Larry Elder will do, talking very specifically about the pandemic and saying, we cannot afford to have this guy. And that is the thrust of the Newsom campaign. And I think it's working because now you got a very clear choice for him. For the voters between the governor we've got, and the polling shows that most Californians do approve of the way Gavin Newsom has handled the pandemic. It's not even that close. A choice between what we're getting and what we could get if you allow Larry Elder to come in. And they're not even talking about the other Republican candidates, and I don't think many of them have a shot. I mean, Kevin Faulconer is really kind of the big loser here, too moderate for the base of the Republican Party in California. So that's the way Newsom is painting it now, and I think it's working to his benefit.
Let's talk a little bit more about how the pandemic is playing into all this. As Doug kind of laid out at the beginning of the conversation, a lot of the original momentum that the recall campaign enjoyed was as a result of Newsom's missteps on the one hand with the French Laundry, but also just the fact that the pandemic was getting so much worse and Californians were really feeling the pain to such a degree. And now we see the pandemic getting worse once again, to a lot of people's surprise. Dan Schnur, once again with UC Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies, how do you see that playing into the campaign going forward?
I guess there's a couple of things to think about here, Keith. Mark Baldessari, who is the very smart president of the Public Policy Institute of California, who runs the poll we've been talking about, has essentially dubbed this the pandemic election. And I think he's exactly right. Last year, the sponsors of the recall were really struggling to get anyone to sign their petitions. And it wasn't until last November, when at the same time that Governor Newsom called for a much more stringent shutdown of California and was warning us about not gathering for the holidays, for Thanksgiving, for Christmas, for Hanukkah, and so on, at the same time that he was found to have attended this now infamous dinner in Napa Valley. After that dinner, that's when the recall petitions really took off. And they gathered over 1 million signatures just in the weeks after that dinner. So the pandemic allowed the recall to qualify. Last spring, when it looked like the state was beginning to open up, it began to appear that Newsom had a safer lead in terms of defeating the recall. Earlier this summer, when the Delta variant began to emerge, that's when we began to show polls showing that the race was very close, at least among likely voters. And now the other really interesting thing in this week's PPIC poll is, completely aside from the way voters feel about the recall election itself, voters, by double the margin they did in last January, voters approve with over 70% of the way Newsom has handled the pandemic. They don't like masks and vaccines and social distancing, but generally they're giving him a lot more credit than they did earlier this summer. And more than anything, that's fueled his improvement in the polls in the context of the recall.
And what should we read into that? Because obviously the lockdown measures have been very uncomfortable, very disruptive. Most people don't like wearing masks. And here, as some people have reported, Governor Newsom seems to be leaning into his tough on COVID message. Should we just understand that as Californians now being more afraid of COVID than they are angry at Newsom?
I would say this, that the best campaigners in more conventional elections always try to frame an election as a choice. Joe Biden used to like to say, compare me to the alternative, not to the almighty. And what Newsom is doing is, as much as he's running against Larry Elder, Doug, not surprisingly, is exactly right on that. As aggressively as Newsom is running against Larry Elder, he's running just as aggressively against the states of Florida and Texas. Mm-hmm. And he's saying, you might not love all the things I'm asking for, but you really want to be going through what they're dealing with in those other states. And for the most part, California voters are saying, no, we don't want that. And that seems to have elevated Newsom considerably heading into the last week or so.
I think Dan is exactly right. I think that Californians, however they feel about opening and closing and lockdowns and mandates, they look at what's going on around the country with the Delta variant, and they see that we're in much better shape in California than a lot of other places are. And I don't think they blame, at least most Democrats and most independents, Republicans not so much, don't blame the governor for the steps that are being taken. They see that actually they've kept them safe and alive in many cases, particularly in the Bay Area, that's true. And so they don't hold him personally responsible for what they have to do to get through this pandemic. And I do think Dan is right. Even though the Newsom campaign has not hit as hard on the Florida and Texas thing as maybe they could have, it's easy for people to see what's going on in the South and in places where there aren't vaccine mandates and mask mandates and say, well, we don't have that here, so we're doing a pretty good job.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to reintroduce you both one more time. Reminding everybody that they are listening to KCBS In Depth. I'm Keith Menconi, talking about the upcoming recall election against Governor Newsom, now just over a week away, with KCBS political reporter Doug Sovern, also joined right now by Dan Schnur, a longtime California political strategist who's a professor at 3 California universities, including UC Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies. All right, so let's try to get a handle on what the other major issues are in the race. I know, Doug, that you've watched some of the debates that have taken place among the challengers. What are people talking about there? Homelessness, the housing crunch. What are the major issues in California that have risen to the surface among these challengers?
Well, let's be clear. There are, of course, major issues. And before the pandemic, homelessness and housing was number one in California. But all those other issues have been obliterated by the pandemic, by the wildfires, in recent weeks, by things like Afghanistan. People are most concerned about coronavirus and wildfire, climate change, things like that. Homelessness is there, of course, and it's gotten worse. And the Republicans have been hitting hard on crime, rising crime, on homelessness. Water is an issue, the same issues we've had for years in California. And they will once again take their place at the top of that list once we're past the pandemic. But at the moment, everything is sort of dwarfed by pandemic management. But sure, school choice, water wars, policy on that, how are you going to fix homelessness? They've all got plans. And those are things that obviously people care very deeply about in California, but those are not the things that are driving this race, because if they were, Newsom would be in more trouble because, he's vulnerable on homelessness, he's vulnerable on crime. Republicans are hitting those things hard, and I don't see them getting that much traction.
Dan Schnur, would you agree with this? If this is the pandemic, recall, then are we not in a good position to read into this recall anything about the state of California politics? By which I mean, does this tell us anything about the general sense of discontent that many Californians are feeling right now? Or is this just not the recall to tell us anything about, California's overall sentiments?
Well, in fact, public opinion polls show that Californians are noticeably more positive about the state's future than they have been recently. So there seems to be at least a sense of perseverance. No one likes the COVID restrictions and the challenges that it presents, but there does seem to be a sense of determination in public opinion polling. I think Doug outlined very effectively not just the issues dominating the recall, but the issues most likely to dominate Newsom's reelection campaign next year, should he survive the recall later this month. I'd add one to that list, which is a tremendous stroke of good luck for the governor and his team. An issue that really hasn't mattered much in state politics recently because it's been considered a settled issue for so long is the issue of abortion rights. And the decision of the state of Texas to impose what many would call a very draconian limit on the number of abortions available in that state. And the decision by the U.S. Supreme Court not to put a stay on the new Texas law. Now, they haven't ruled that it's constitutional yet, but they're not putting a stay on it. This has elevated the issue of abortion rights in a way that has not been the case in this country for many, many years. And even though Elder and the other Republicans, both pro-life and pro-choice, argue that it's an issue of minimal relevance in a state race, if it's an issue that voters care about, in a deep blue state bordering on indigo like California, it's even less likely that voters are going to elect a Republican to office than they would under more conventional circumstances.
It's true. That's, that puts the Republicans on the defensive, and there are single issue abortion voters in California who will never risk voting for a Republican, and that only works to Newsom's benefit.
Yeah. All right. Another interesting political development in the closing days of this race. Just have a few minutes left, but want to raise a couple more issues with you. In particular, one of the controversial approaches that Governor Newsom has taken to this race is to encourage voters not to vote for, encourages supporters anyway, not to vote for somebody in that second question, who to replace him. Doug, what exactly has Governor Newsom been saying there, and what's the logic behind that appeal?
Yeah, I wrote a whole blog post about this on the Sovern Nation blog that I thought it was a big mistake. From Newsom's point of view, it's smart, I suppose, tactically. Keep it simple message, vote no, don't worry about the rest. From the point of view of the voters, though, to me, you're being asked to vote, so vote. There's two things. Why would you leave the choice to the people who want him recalled if you're against the recall? So he's just simplified it, boiled it down to vote no on the recall. Don't muddy the waters. He doesn't want to repeat the mistake of 2003 when Lieutenant Governor Cruz Bustamante ran on the vote no on the recall, but vote for me just in case as a backup. It was a big mess. He lost badly. Democrats were confused. He wants to clarify it, and it seems to be working for him. And I think most Democrats, or at least a sizable plurality, are going to leave that second part blank. I've had so many asking me, what do I do? Who should I vote for? And, half of the 46, I think 24 of them are Republicans. But there's 9 Democrats and a couple of Greens and a Libertarian and 10 no party preference candidates. It's a motley crew of people who probably lack the experience and wherewithal to be governor, but there is somebody you could vote for there. And my feeling is vote for somebody because that's what you're being asked to do. But again, the governor doesn't even want to go there, keep it simple, and I think it's probably working for him.
And Dan Schnur, again, with UC Berkeley's Institute of Governmental Studies, I know that you've had some harsh words for Governor Newsom on this point.
Well, Ian, given Newsom's efforts to prevent any other Democrat from running, and given his efforts to convince Democrats not to vote on the second question, the governor's taking an immense risk. And if you do believe the Public Policy Institute poll, then it looks like that risk may pay off. But as Doug said earlier, it is still entirely possible, and I'll add particularly in an off-year, low-turnout election, if you believe that there is at least some possibility, or that there has been some possibility that the recall would pass even by one vote, Newsom has left his party and his deep blue state very, very exposed to the near certainty that a Republican would replace him as governor. My own feeling is that if he dodges that bullet and does survive, it's something that will not be remembered for a long time. But it strikes me as a tremendously selfish act. And that rather than saying, while I'd like to be governor, there's plenty of other Democrats who I'd rather have replace me than Larry Elder or John Cox or Kevin Kiley or Kevin Faulconer, the efforts to prevent any other Democrat from being there as a safety net really does strike me as self-interest. Now, politicians are self-interested. That's why they're politicians. And the risk may pay off, but it is an immense risk nonetheless.
I do think that from Newsom's point of view, he probably figured if we have the lieutenant governor or any viable Democrat on that list, there may be too many Democrats who either say, oh, it's not that big a deal. If he gets recalled, we'll have this other Democrat. Or so they won't bother voting. Or they'll say, well, I don't really like him, but this wouldn't be so bad. And he just wanted to avoid that completely. But I agree with Dan's characterization of it. I would not have done it if I were him, but I'm not the governor, and then he doesn't listen to me. So we'll see how it all turns out September 14th.
I'm sure he's rapped on your blogs every word, Doug Sovern.
Sure.
But we will find the answers to all these questions in not too much more time. Certainly a strange confluence of political events that has brought us to where we are, but time will tell. We have been speaking so far to KCBS political reporter Doug Sovern. Once again, Doug, thank you so much.
Thanks, Keith. Thanks for having me.
And thanks as well to Dan Schnur. He is a longtime California political strategist, now a professor at 3 California universities, including UC Berkeley. Dan Schnur, thank you as well.
Thank you very much, Keith. I really appreciate it as well.
And thank you all for listening. For KCBS and In Depth, I'm Keith Menconi. Stay safe, be well. We'll see you next week.
You've been listening to KCBS In Depth. Get every episode by subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other podcast platforms. Visit kcbsradio.com for more news and interviews. We are the Bay Area's news station, KCBS.